So, after identifying problems, so we will now proceed on the second step, which is the formulation of hypothesis. So when we say hypothesis, it predicts a possible answer to the problem or question. Okay, so there is the term predict. In short, when we say hypothesis, it is your guess. It is the possible answer to your problem, but it's not yet the answer to the problem. So that is hypothesis. Okay? Yun lang yung hula mo na pwedeng sumagot sa problem, but it's not yet really the answer. Okay? So therefore, madaming hypothesis na pwedeng lumabas. Okay? So madami kang hypothesis na pwedeng i-test. Madami kang prediction na pwedeng sabihin. But it's not yet really the answer. Okay? It is just a prediction. So that is what an hypothesis. Hypothesis in science term, it is known as the educated guess. It is the possible answer to our problem. Okay? A good hypothesis allows you, okay, to then make a prediction. Okay? A positive prediction. Okay? So, in constructing hypothesis, you have to understand that there is a good hypothesis. You have to separate good hypothesis from bad hypothesis. So always remember that there is a good question. If there is a good question, there must also a good hypothesis. So how will we identify if your hypothesis is good or a bad hypothesis? Okay, so very simple. If your hypothesis answer the question how. If your hypothesis answer the question how, therefore it is a good type of hypothesis. For example, if I do this, then this will happen. Okay, example. Okay, if I increase the amount of fertilizer, then seed will grow faster. Is it a good hypothesis or a bad hypothesis? Okay, does this statement answer the question how? So let's see. So, the seed will grow how? How the seed will grow? If you increase the amount of fertilizer. So therefore, this statement is a good hypothesis because it's answered the question how. I repeat, a good hypothesis must answer the question how. Okay, so let's go back to Jungkook. How Jungkook formulate his hypothesis. After talking with his teacher and conducting further research, he comes up with a hypothesis, an educated guess. He comes up with a possible answer to the problem. Okay, so this is the hypothesis of Jungkook. So A, if more sugar is added, then the bread will rise higher. Kung madami ka raw sugar na ilalagay, mag-expand or lalaki yung bread. Or, the second hypothesis, if less ang sugar, the bread will rise higher. Kung onti yung sugar, tataas or mag-expand ng malaki yung bread. Or, sugar has no effect on the rising of the bread. So, sabihin, yung sugar, wala siyang effect doon sa pag-expand ng bread. And remember that our question is, or our problem is, how does the amount of sugar affect the size of the bread? So this is, or these are the hypotheses made by Jungkook. These are, for Jungkook, these are the possible answer to the problem, to his problem. Okay, so that is what hypothesis is. Okay, hypothesis. So let's elaborate more. The hypothesis is an educated guess about relationship between the independent and your dependent variable. Okay? Hypothesis must link connection to your variable. So, kailangan si hypothesis magkukonect siya doon sa independent at sa dependent variable. Okay? And your hypothesis must answer the question how. So now, let's talk about variable. When we say variable, a variable is a quantity or condition that can change. Okay, so what is variable in research? So we know that in research, a variable refers to a person, place, thing, or phenomenon that you are trying to measure in some way. Okay, so when we say variable, these are the condition, these are the quantity that you want to measure. Whether it's a person, a place, thing, or phenomenon, basta ito yung gusto mong aralin, gusto mong sukatin. So, that is your variables. Now, there are two types of variables. So, these are the independent variables and the dependent variables. So, let's talk about first the independent variables. The independent variables is the other term for independent variable is the manipulated variables. Okay, in short, when we say independent variable, this is the cause. Siya yung dahilan. Okay? Siya yung dahilan kung bakit nagkakaroon ng gantong epekto. Okay? So, the independent variables are sometimes called as manipulated. Why manipulated? Because it is a factor that is intentionally varied by the experimenter. Okay? It is the factor that can change, or this is a factor that can be changed during the experiment by the experimenter. For example, Jungkook is going to use 50 grams, 60, 70, 80 grams of sugar. So, our experimenter is si Jungkook. The person who conduct experiment is known as the experimenter. So, si Jungkook ang experimenter natin. So, since Jungkook used the different grams of sugar, different weight or weight of sugar, therefore, okay, it is the independent variable. The amount of sugar is the independent variable. The cause, siya yung magiging dahilan ng sudden change or ng pagbabago. Okay? We also have what's so-called the dependent variable. If independent variable is manipulated variable, dependent variable is our responding variable. It means this is now the result. Siya yung magiging product. Okay? Siya yung naapektuhan ni independent variable. So, this is now the result. So, yung cause, yung dahilan, ay si independent. So, ang result or product ay si dependent variable. Have here a drill. So, write the independent and dependent variable for each hypothesis statement. I feel happy every time I see a green plant. So, what is your independent variable? Cause. Okay? Anong dahilan why you feel happy? Very good. So, our independent variable is the green plants. Okay. So, what is the result? Every time na makikita mo yung green plants, ano yung nararamdaman mo? You feel very happy. So, that is our dependent variable. That is the result. That every time you see the green plant, okay, yung green plant ang dahilan kung bakit ka nagiging masaya. Okay, isa ka ng plantita or plantito. Okay, so that is what independent and dependent variable is. I have here the next example. The height of the plant depends on the type of soil. So, which is our independent variable? The cause. Wow, very good. Our independent variable is the type of soil. Okay? And our result, okay, kapag ang height ng plant daw ay nakadepende saan? Okay, sa height ni plant. So, this is our dependent variable. Okay. So, Next one. Next slide. If plant gets sunlight, then they will grow. So what is the cause of the change? Very good. So the cause of the change is the sunlight. Okay? So yung dahilan kung bakit ang halaman ay lumalaki. Plant grows. Okay? So this is our dependent variable. If the plant gets sunlight, so sa yung dahilan, every time na makakakuha siya ng sunlight, that is the time na siya ay lalaki. That is the result or the product. Next one. If the plant gets water, then they will grow. So what is our independent variable? The cause. Okay. The water. Every time daw na natutubigan or didiligan yung halaman, ano mangyayari sa kanya? Ano magiging resulta? Okay, the plant will grow. So that is our dependent and independent variable. Next one. Okay, what is the independent variable in Jungkook's experiment? Okay, what is the answer? Again, when you say independent variable, this is the cause. Dahilan. So what is your answer? It is the... Wow! Okay, the answer is letter A. Okay, terrific. Okay, you're on the right track. You're listening. Okay, next. What is our dependent variable? Okay, when we say dependent variable, this is the result or responding variable. Okay, is it A, B, or C? Okay, it is letter B. Okay, if pabago-bago ang sugar, then the size of the loaf bread also change. So that is our dependent variable. Cool. Let's go back with the problem let's go with the problem that formulated by Jungkook. Okay, the question is, or the problem that Jungkook formulated is that, does the amount of sugar affect the size of the bread? Okay, so our independent variable is the amount of sugar. Okay, so remember that Jungkook is our experimenter. Yung amount ng sugar ang pwede niyang bagu-baguhin. As a result, kapag binago-bago niya yung amount of sugar, as a result, magkakaroon ng different sizes ang bread, which is our dependent variable. Okay, so that is what dependent and independent variable. So every time you change your independent variable, so automatically magkakaroon ng pagbabago kay dependent because nakadepende nga siya kay independent. These variables is very dependent to the independent variables that we're using in our activity or in our experiment. Okay, so I mentioned about experiment. So the third step of scientific method is conducting our experiment. Okay, experiment is a setup to observe how something happened or to test your hypothesis. Okay, so we're done with the problem. We identify already the problem. We know already the hypothesis. We have done the possible answer. Now, this hypothesis now can be tested through experiment. So this includes the variables or the quantity that is changed during the experiment or being measured. So that is what an experiment is. So you have your hypothesis, but it's not the end. Kailangan lahat ng hypothesis is itetest to come up with the best result. Okay, let's go back with the experiment. His teacher helps him come up with the procedure and least needed materials. Okay, she discusses with Jungkook how to determine the control group and set up. Okay, so in the experiment, Jungkook prepared two groups. So the first group is control and the second group is the experiment. Or no, experimental group. Okay, so let's differentiate the two. Okay, so again, so Jun could come up with these two groups. In an experiment, data from an experimental group is compared with the data from a controlled group. Okay, these two groups should be identical in every respect except one. Okay, the difference between a control group and experimental group is that the independent variable is changed for the experimental group. Okay, si independent variable is babago-baguhin natin in our experimental group. And on the other hand, kay control group, okay, so yung mga variables natin will kept the same. Okay? Hindi siya mababago or kailangan may standard tayong sinusundan. Okay? So, the function of these two group is for comparison. We need to compare the data of the control group to the experimental group. As I said, when we say control group, it is a scientific experiment. In a scientific experiment, the control group that serve as in scientific experiment, the control group is serve as the standard of comparison. Okay? So yung ikukumpara na yung observation natin from the experiment should be compared on the control group. It may be no treatment or an experiment selected group. So walang treatment na gagamitin. Kaya all the variables are kept the same. While in experimental group, so yung independent variable natin, okay, imamanipulate ni experimenter to come up with a result that can be compared now to our control group. For example, remember that our problem is to know if the amount of sugar affects the size of the bread. So remember that our control group, lahat ng yan is constant. Hindi siya pwedeng baguhin. Okay? And our experimental group, so yung our independent variable, siya yung ating babaguhin from time to time to see the result. Okay. So look at our control group. Okay, you have the yeast. Okay, both control and experimental group use the same variables aside from the fact that in control group, ang ginamit niya lang is 50 grams of sugar. Okay, I repeat, the characteristic of control group is that all the variables are kept the same, pareho. Okay, while in experimental group, si independent variable natin is mag-undergo ng changes to see the difference. As you can see in our experimental group, Jungkook used 60, 70, and 80 grams of sugar. So, nagbago ang our independent variable. Okay. So, let's go back with the experiment of Jungkook. Jungkook's teacher reminds him to keep all other factors the same so that any observed changes in the bread can be attributed to the variation in the amount of sugar. Okay, that's why Jungkook come up with the fair test. When you say fair test, all the factors that the experimenter attempts to keep the same in the experiment. So, lahat ng factors or variables na gusto i-maintain, na gusto ipare-pareho ni experimenter is what you so-called the fair test. So, what is the function of the fair test? The fair test is used to make sure that in an experiment, one factor or condition, that is our independent variable, affects the other factor, which is the dependent variable. So, by keeping all other conditions constant or the same for the comparison. Okay, so that is what you so-called constant variables. Okay, the difference between the control and the experimental. So whatever changes happens or whatever data na makukuha sa experimental group can be um, compared to the result happen for the control group. So it is a source of comparison. Let's go back with Jungkook. Jungkook writes out his procedure for his experiment along with material lists in his journal. He has both of this checked by his teacher where she checks for any safety concern. Okay, so this is an example of layout for experimental design. So most of science students like you use this format. Okay, it's very common to a science student. Okay, let's talk about trials. Okay, so when we say trials, it refers to the replicate. Refers to the replicate groups that are exposed to the same condition. Okay, Jungkook is going to test each sugar 3 times. Or when we say trials, it is the repetition of the process introduced to the variable. So why do we need to have trials? Bakit kailangan natin ulit-ulitin? Great. Okay, because we need to repeat the trials for us to avoid mistakes and errors. Okay? So that is why we have to come up with the trials, to come up with unified data or unified result. Okay? So that is how trials is important in an experiment. So that is trials. So we're now on the fourth step of scientific method. So this is to observe, record, and analyze data. So once you're done with your experiment, or if your experiment is complete, okay, you may now collect your measurements, you may now collect your data and form calculations, okay, and you have to interpret whether this data supported your hypothesis. Okay, sometimes, so some scientists often find their prediction were not accurate. So sometimes we find our experiment which is not accurate and our hypothesis was not supported. In such cases like this, we need to back and construct new hypothesis and create prediction based on our information that we learned from our previous experiment. Okay, so we need to start over and over again. So that is how observation, record, and analyze result goes. Okay, in the case of Jungkook, let's go back with Jungkook's example. Okay, Jungkook's come up with this table. So wherein he created a table where he can easily analyze his data and result. Okay, so this is now the result gathered by Jungkook. So Jungkook again used to experiment, right? He used the control and experimental group. You still remember that in control, Jungkook uses 50 grams of sugar for his experimental research. So he used 60, 70, and 80 grams of sugar. So how will we interpret this one? So, when Jungkook used 60 grams of sugar after three trials, he come up with 1,380 centimeter cube as the average size of the loaf bread. When he used 70 grams of sugar, so he come up with 1,612 cubic centimeter height of the loaf bread. And if he used the 80 grams of sugar, so he come up with 1,332 height of the loaf bread. Okay, during the experimental research or experimental group, okay, in control group, so for 50 grams of sugar, so Junko come up with 1,344 cubic meter as height of his bread loaf. Okay, Okay, those data gathered by Jungkook helps him to make his conclusion. So what is conclusion? Conclusion must answer your problem. Okay? So conclusion must base on the result of your experiment. Okay, so this is now the data gathered by Jungkook, and what is his conclusion? So his conclusion, the conclusion of Jungkook is, okay, so if you notice, at 70 grams of sugar, doon lang tumaas yung, or doon lang mas mataas yung loaf bread. So therefore, he conclude that if he use 70 grams of sugar, then, excuse me, the loaf bread's height increased at 1,612 cubic centimeter, which is the highest result. Okay, if he used the highest result from the sample sugar that he used in baking the loaf bread. So, sabihin, pag ginamit niya yung 70 grams ng sugar, mas mataas or mas mataas na loaf bread yung mapuproduce niya. Okay? Mas mataas na loaf bread yung mapuproduce niya kaysa doon sa gagamit siya ng 50 grams na sugar na ginamit natin sa control. So that is the conclusion of Jungkook. Okay, so we're now on the last stage of scientific method, which is to communicate the result. Okay, communicating result means you have to share your result to others to counter check or to validate your work. So most of the researchers or scientists often communicate their research result in different ways. So one is to publish the result in peer-reviewed journals that can be read by other scientists. And the other is to present their result at national and international conference when other scientists can listen to presentation for more validation and for some of the corrections. So you need to publish your work. You need to share your work so that the other researchers can use your data or your result as their guide. Okay, to produce a more precise and more accurate answer to your problem, to the problem that you proposed. So that is how communicate the result flows. So we're done with we complete now the different steps of scientific method. So before we end our discussion for this day, let's have a recall. Okay, remember that we discussed about the first step, which is the identify problem or question. For step 2, you have to formulate your hypothesis. For step 3, we need to conduct experiment to test our hypothesis. For step 4, we need to record and analyze the data. For step 5, we have to draw our conclusion out of the data we gathered from step 4. And the last stage, we have to communicate the result. So these are the different steps of scientific method. Okay, so that ends our discussion for this day. Thank you and good day. Bye.